and I am the Rural Branch Manager with Chinook Regional Libraries. We would like to begin our presentation today by making a land acknowledgement. It is a sign of respect to recognize the ties Indigenous people have to the land and its important culture, ceremonies, and traditions. So let us begin by acknowledging that we are on traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory. While this is a digital program and our speakers and attendees are from all around Canada and beyond, this program is based out of Swift Current, which is located on Treaty 4 territory. This is the original lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We are committed to moving forward in partnership with our Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
Good day, I'm Swift Current Mayor Al Bridle, and it is my honor to welcome everyone who is attending the Truth and Reconciliation Speaker Series virtually today. Today's speaker will be the Honourable Senator Murray Sinclair, who I'm told has just recently retired. Congratulations to you, sir, on a distinguished career. Senator Sinclair was the first Indigenous judge to serve on the bench in Manitoba, and only the second Indigenous judge to be appointed in Canada. I'd like to thank Senator Sinclair for joining us today, and in addition, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our event partners, SaskCulture, the Chinook School Division, Innovation Credit Union, the Southwest Multicultural Association, the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan, Great Plains College, the Newcomers Welcome Centre, the City of Swift Current, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, the Chinook Regional Library, and many other individuals from the community. Thank you for this opportunity to bring greetings on behalf of the City of Swift Current. Please enjoy your day.
Hi again, it's me, Ashley, from the Chinook Regional Library. I thought I would share some of what our patrons have been sharing with us about their own personal efforts to contribute towards reconciliation. We had a campaign that recently just finished where people were able to share those, so I thought I would read some of them. I will listen more than I talk, says Grace 63, and I will give space to survivors, storytellers, elders. We have much to learn from them. And then we have another one here which says, I think channeling an open and honest discussion in our communities can help us move forward. It can often be an uncomfortable discussion. I just found out a family friend is a residential school survivor. I hope more people feel empowered to talk about these things as our communities move forward with reconciliation. And I've got a very cute one here. This is by Joanna and Mum, and it's got a little disclaimer here which says this means listen to your elders. So I think that's quite nice too.
Hello everyone. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you the speaker for today's event. He was the first Aboriginal judge appointed in Manitoba and the second in Canada. He also served as co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as Chief Commissioner of the Federal Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We are very privileged to hear his thoughts on reconciliation following the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Report with the 94 calls to action and his perspective on what the future holds for us. Friends, please join me in welcoming His Honor Murray Sinclair. He also served as co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as Chief Commissioner of the Federal Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We are very privileged to hear his thoughts on reconciliation following the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Report with the 94 calls to action and his perspective on what the future holds for us. Friends, please join me in welcoming His Honor Murray Sinclair. He also served as co-chair of the
Thank you. I still hear voices, but I assume that I can talk now. So thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of your gathering here today and for being part of your speaker series. I appreciate the effort that the community has been giving to discussing issues around reconciliation. And I hope that what I'm going to be able to contribute today will assist in some of those discussions and those dialogues. I have a picture I want to show you. just so you can also get your pictures ready, because I want you to look at your pictures. All right. Take a look at this little girl here. She's 5 years old in this photo. And she's my granddaughter. Her name is Sarah. She's now going to be 15 in her next birthday, but that picture was taken on the day that we started our work in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I often get asked by people what motivated you to do this work, and how were you able to manage all of the pressures and the stresses of doing this work. And I would say to them, it's because I always kept the survivors in mind. I always thought about them as I was doing my work, but I also thought about the children of the survivors and the little children like Sarah, because when the children were taken away and put in residential school, they were not much older than that. Many of them, in fact, were 5 years old and taken away and placed in residential schools and not allowed to see their families again. And I know that each of you has a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old in your family, or a little baby, perhaps. And at a later point during the presentation, I'm going to give you an opportunity to just take a look at that picture, or if you want to take it out now and just look at it as we're talking, that would be fine. And if you are with other people, you can discuss what that picture means to you and what that child means to you, because the one thing I always tell people is if you want to try to understand the ramifications or the impact that residential schools had on the children who were taken there, imagine what it would be like for you if somebody came to your house today from the government of Canada and took your child away from you and said to you, we're taking your child because we're going to educate them in an institution, but you will not be allowed to come and see them. You will not be allowed to take them out. You will have no choice about what they're taught. You will have no say about anything that happens to them in the school. And in fact, if you try to take them out of the school, or if you refuse to send them to the school, you will be prosecuted. You will be arrested. You will be put in jail until your child is in school. Because that's the way the government handled this, virtually from the time of Confederation. Up until Confederation, the relationship between Indigenous people and the government of Canada was on a nation-to-nation basis. Essentially, the government of Canada and the Crown and Right of England and the colonial governments did not interfere with the way that Indigenous people were doing their own business, were conducting their own affairs. They didn't interfere with the way that communities were organizing themselves, the way they were governing themselves. They didn't interfere with leadership selection. They didn't interfere with the way that children were being educated. They offered them the opportunity to go to the schools sometimes that they were running for the non-Indigenous children, but that was very rarely taken up voluntarily. Missionary schools were sometimes created and offered to Indigenous children as well, but not many children went to those schools. For the most part, Indigenous children were not being sent to schools being run by white society before and at the time of Confederation, because as with most families, they wanted their children to be educated in their way. They wanted them to learn to speak their language. They wanted them to know their history. They wanted them to know their culture. They wanted them to know who they were. Because every society strives to ensure that their children growing up, their young people as they get into adulthood, are able to answer 4 very important questions. And those questions are, where do I come from? And that's about the history of the people. It's about your ancestors. It's about your grandparents. It's about all of the things that they did, all of their accomplishments. It's also about your mythical heroes or your real heroes of the past. It's about the battles and the wars and the way that your society or your community was organized. It's about the important events in the past that shaped the way the people have become. But it's also inclusive of things like your creation story. Every society has a creation story, and all creation stories are true. The creation story for my people, the Ojibwe people, is different from the creation story that the Muslim people teach. It's different from the creation story that the Buddhist people teach. It's different from the creation story that the Christians teach in the Bible. But all of those creation stories are true because that's the creation story that you have been given by the Creator. And that's what He wanted you to guide your life by, the teachings that come from that creation story. And understanding how this place was created is an important part of understanding what your place is in this creation. And so when you are told your creation story, you are also being told about where you belong and how you relate to all of the things of creation. So Indigenous people had their own creation stories. And that's part of answering that first question, where do I come from? Because it helps you understand that your people are a valid people. Your people have a real history, and it's an important history, and that you have an obligation to remember that history and to pass it on to your children and to pass it on to your grandchildren to make sure that they know their place in the world and their relationship to the Creator. And the second question that every society ensures that their children are taught and learn about is, where am I going? So it's not only about where do I come from, but it's also about where am I going? What does my future look like? What do we know about the future? And what do we know about how I will be in the future? And learning about that is important because we learn about our future through learning about the future of other people. When other people were growing up, they will tell you what they were thinking, how they were doing things, what they learned in order to prepare for their future. And that helps you prepare for your future too. So learning the answer to that question really helps you prepare for your own future. And that's an important question to every young person, every child. And we want to ensure that they know that. They know how that works. That question and the answer to that question also is about what happens to me when I die. When I leave this physical existence, where do I go? What happens to me? And so it's about teaching about your return to the Creator, your return to the spirit world. And all Indigenous road teachings have teachings about where your spirit goes after your body is finished its life here. Your spirit will continue on and go somewhere else and do something else with perhaps someone else. And so you learn about that, just as Christians learn that and Buddhists learn that, Muslim people learn that. We also know that. And that helps us understand and appreciate and respect life and respect death as well, and not fear it. So those two questions, where do I come from and where am I going, are very important questions for all of us. And the third question, which is also very important, is why am I here? What's my purpose in life? And understanding your purpose in life, understanding why you were created, is an important part of being, an important part of why we do what we do, and what is it that we should do, and where do we learn those things? How do we know those things? Well, we learn them from our elders, we learn them from our parents, we learn them from our siblings, we learn them from our relatives, but we also learn them from the teachings that we have about who we are. So in our society, the Ojibwe society, the Anishinaabe people, we teach our children that when they are born, when in fact they are created, a spirit comes to them from the Creator. And that spirit that is placed within them has a name. And when you ask an elder to do a naming ceremony for you, that elder is being asked to find out what the name of the spirit that is already within you has. And if you know the name of that spirit, then you also, through the teaching of that elder who does that ceremony, you also learn why that spirit was sent to you, because that spirit has a purpose. There's a reason why the Creator put that spirit in you. And then you know one of the reasons why you are here, because that spirit is using your body and your mind to fulfill his or her ambition and role and responsibility as designated by the Creator. But that spirit is not separate from you. That spirit is part of you. That spirit is you, and you are that spirit. So you have to learn about that. And that's what the naming ceremony is all about. And therefore, as you are growing up, you not only learn what your name is, you learn why you carry that name. So, as an example, my name, my spirit's name, is Mizenegijik. Mizenegijik in Anishinaabe means pictures in the sky, but it isn't just literally pictures in the sky. There's a story about a spirit that carries that name. Excuse me. And the story is that at one time in the early life of Anishinaabe people in this world, the people were in turmoil. They were in trouble. They were troubled by things. They were hungry. They were starving. They couldn't find food to eat. And there was difficulties within the community. There were difficulties within the tribe, and people were fighting with each other and not getting along well. And there was a lack of peace reduced among the people. And so this young boy, it is said, according to the naming story that I carry, that he saw all that was going on around him, and he wondered why that was happening and whether there was something he could do about it. So he went out into a quiet place in amongst the trees and on a small hill, and he sat there and he asked the Creator, why are all of these things happening? And then he sat there expecting the Creator to give him the answer, because he had been taught that if you ask the Creator something, the Creator will show you the answer. The Creator will respond to your prayer. And so he asked that question, what can I do about all of this that's going on? And he sat there. They say he sat there for many days, putting aside his food and his water, waiting for an answer from the Creator to that question. And as he sat there during that time, he began to get more and more frustrated. And finally, towards the end, he started shouting out loud to the Creator, why are you not answering me? Why are you not helping me to find the answer for my people? And as he was doing that, they say that from the ground there appeared this tiny little creature that popped up out of the earth. And in the language, they use the same word that we use for a vole. It's like a little mouse popped up out of the ground. And he said, this little vole said to this young man, "Why are you shouting? Why are you making so much noise? You're disturbing all of us." And the young man looked at the vole and he said, "Well, I'm here to talk to the Creator. And I asked the Creator a question. He's not answering my question." And the vole said, "Well, what's the question?" And so the young man told him what the question was. And the vole looked at him and said, "I think you're an idiot." In the language, it sounds quite humorous the way they expressed it. "I think you're an idiot." And the young man was kind of shocked by that. And he said, "Why are you saying that to me?" And the vole said, "Because the Creator is showing you the answers to your question. He's answering your question." And the young man said, "Well, I don't hear him. He's not talking to me." And the vole said, "Well, the Creator talks in many different ways to us." He said, "Just look up there in the sky, and you will see that He is sending you images about what it is that you are to do. I can see them right now," he said. "Can you not see them?" And as that young man looked up into the sky, he indeed could see images in the sky that told him things about what it is that he was to go back and tell the people. So that's where my name comes from. The one who speaks of images in the sky. That's what my name means, and that's how the elders interpret it. Mizanagijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. And so that young man went back, and by telling those people about what he had seen in those images, he was able to help them to coexist better, to get along better, to be able to hunt more carefully, and how to approach the animals before they took their lives, and how to be more respectful. And so he brought back to the people a great teaching that he had learned from the Creator. And so that was my name, and that's the name I carry ever since I was born. I've had that name. And that's the work that I have always done throughout my life. I've always spent time, when I can, sitting in creation, asking the Creator just to talk to me and show me what it is that I must do. So I very rarely ever make a big decision without spending some time meditating about it in that way. And I always get an answer. And I always use that to go back and help the people. And that's the third question. What is my purpose in life? I also learned that the clan that I belong to, the family that I come from, also has a purpose within the governing structure of the community. And I am responsible for helping the clan to fulfill that purpose too. And so in doing what I do, I know that the clan that I belong to, which is the Water Clan, from that clan come our thinkers and our philosophers and our seers, the ones who can look into the future and see the way things should be and will be, and to tell the people what they need to do to prepare for that. Part of my clan in traditional teachings, that's the work of the Water Clan people. And so in those two ways, through my spirit name and through my clan membership, I know what my purpose is. And that leads us to be able to answer the fourth question, the final question, the really, really big question, which is, who am I? Who am I? And sometimes we try to figure that fourth question out without looking at the first three. Who am I is a really big question. And they say actually that you can never answer that question until just as you're leaving this creation. Then you know who you are. It's at that point that the answer becomes clear to you, because it is at that point then, when you look back at all that you have done, that you realize why you did what you did, and therefore who you were meant to be. And that's why they say that fourth question is a never-ending question. You're always asking it, and you're always striving to answer it. So those are the big questions that we all grow up with. Everybody grows up with them. I grew up with it. You grew up with your questions too. Those are the same questions. And you find ways to learn the answers to those questions. But when Indigenous people were taken away from their culture and placed in those residential schools, their ability to answer those questions for themselves was taken away from them. Those elders that would help them answer those questions were lost to them. Their family members that would support them in finding and seeking out those answers were not there to help them do that. And so all that time they spent in those schools, they spent being lost, feeling lost, and drifting away from being able to answer those questions, so that when they did come out of the schools, when they were able to leave the schools, they had literally no real identity. The schools strived to teach them how to be like every other young man and young woman in society, like white children. But they were not accepted because they didn't know really who they were. And they couldn't assert themselves in the face of all of the things that they were challenged to do. They couldn't find a way to fit in to that society, and therefore often fell by the wayside, and often were unable to compete, unable to participate in what was going on around them. And they also encountered racism, of course, on the other side. And one of the reasons for that is because in the schools, in order to convince the children to give up on believing in the ways of their parents, children were taught that their people were inferior, that their language was inferior, that their culture was inferior, their teachings were inferior, and that they had no civilization to speak of, and that they needed to be Christian. That's what the schools taught them. And that very same message was being taught in the public school system too. So even those who were able to escape the residential schools and went to public schools were taught in the public schools that Indigenous people were inferior, that European people were superior, that European people had civilization, Indigenous people didn't have civilization, that Indigenous languages were not worth maintaining and couldn't be spoken, and that their cultures were not worth practicing and couldn't be practiced, that they had to practice the religious ways of European society. And so that message not only was imposed upon Indigenous children, it was also imposed upon non-Indigenous children in the public schools. And so non-Indigenous children came to believe that Indigenous people were inferior and that they came from a culture that was superior. So that is the genesis of why between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is so bad today. Because historically, everything that Canadian society has done was done in order to support those decisions that contributed to those approaches to Indigenous people, to justify taking children away from their parents and placing them in residential schools, to justify what the government was doing through its laws, taking the lands of the Indigenous people, interfering with the way they governed themselves, undermining their traditional leaders, confining people to reserves, imposing the pass system so that you had to have a written permission just to leave your community. The government justified that by saying that these are inferior people and they need us to control their lives better, or they will simply be taken advantage of, or they will be lost. Never mind the fact that Indigenous people have been in this land for well over 25,000 years and able to get by quite successfully, thank you very much, without Europeans having to come here and save us. But that has never been part of Canadian thinking. And newcomers who come to this world as well often come with a preconceived idea that Indigenous people are the same as what the European children have been taught historically in this country, because that's the way children in other parts of the world are also taught about Indigenous people, that they are still running around in loincloths and living in teepees, and they don't know how to take care of themselves, they can't drive cars. It's interesting to talk to newcomers to find out what they knew about Indigenous people before they came here. And they're often surprised to learn, for example, whenever I talk to them, that as an Indigenous person, I was a judge for 30 years, and I was a senator for 5 years, and that I have numerous university degrees. They don't understand how that can happen because they have been told otherwise. So we have a lot of work to do just to get people to recognize that they have been indoctrinated into believing that Indigenous people are inferior, and therefore they are inherently defaulting to treating Indigenous people as inferior people and thinking about them as inferior people who do not have the right they claim to have. And that is probably the biggest hurdle in reconciliation that we have to overcome. That is why I said at the end of the TRC that the key to reconciliation is education. It was education that got us into this through the use of schools. But education and the way we educate our children going forward is the key to reconciliation, because we need to teach our children a fuller sense of the history of this country, including what Indigenous people were doing and thinking and how they were behaving and taking care of themselves before the Europeans came here, so that everybody will know that they were indeed a valid people, a valid civilization. And the way that we talk to and about each other will change as a result of that. So I wanted to share that much with you. There's lots of other aspects of the work of the TRC that we could talk about. There's also lots of other work that the TRC has given rise to that we could talk about. But most of what I've shared with you is probably the basis for what we need to think about going forward when it comes to reconciliation. And that is that we need to understand what existed before and what we did for 150 years in this country, and how that changed the situation for Indigenous people in a negative way, and how it also changed to believing about themselves in a mythically positive way that is not accurate either. So I will leave the floor open for questions. I'll ask whoever the moderator is to take it from here, and I'll be available to answer whatever questions have been floating in. Now, I'm supposed to read questions to you as they come across the screen, incidentally, I think, if I understood correctly. And so far, I don't see any, so that means we're going to get an early recess here. So if you can't type very fast, you better start typing even with your mistakes, because otherwise we're going to have to develop another speech for you. Oh, we're going to give them 5 minutes for questions. Okay. I'm willing to do that. While we're doing that, maybe I'll just share with you that my becoming the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was almost against my will, because I didn't think that I was the right person for it, given the fact that I had just participated in doing an inquiry into the deaths of 12 babies. And that was an emotionally very difficult hearing process. And so I didn't think I was ready to engage in another, what I knew would be an emotional experience. But when the first set of commissioners were appointed and then quit, then I was asked again to step forward, which I did. So I'll read this one. Question from the audience: what is the role that educational institutions should be playing going forward? Well, one of the important things that we called upon educational institutions to do is to change the way that they educate about our history, to ensure that a fuller and more accurate historical story is told about this country. You could have gone to school throughout the history of Canada until relatively recently and never heard a thing about Indigenous people other than the fact that they existed and that they may have helped the fur traders and that they may have sold furs to the Hudson's Bay Company. But you didn't, many people, in fact, grew up right next to a First Nation reservation without even knowing that it was there or knowing anything about it. There was no exchange back and forth between the two. There was no effort for there to be inclusion. And sometimes there were even Indigenous children that were coming to the public school in town, and they were not receiving any information about their own community. They were simply being told the European version of colonization. And one of the things that I have told educators across the country going back to 2012 when we were doing the TRC was that the public school system is guilty of teaching a history of white supremacy. They have been teaching that British colonialism and Quebec colonialism were good features of this nation's history, and that we need to appreciate and respect, and we need to recognize the importance of British common law, British teachings, monarchy, the role of the monarchy, British explorers, French explorers, and the role of the Hudson's Bay Company in expanding this country and expanding the territory. What a good guy Sir John A. Macdonald was. So all of those teachings we know are historically inaccurate, but we still perpetuate some of those stories. And we need to examine how we are educating our children in our schools and in post-secondary institutions as well. And not just Indigenous children, but also because the non-Indigenous children are the ones that are usually the first to gain positions of power and privilege in society because of their ancestry, their relatives' experience, their contacts within the positions of power. I can tell you, when I was working in the courts, there were probably at least 35 to 40% of the judges in the courts where I worked had sons and daughters who went into law, because they had gone into law, and therefore it was easy for their sons and daughters to go into law school. because they had someone who had already done it and somebody who could sort of facilitate their entry into law schools. So those privileges tend to pass from generation to generation. So I say that we need to recognize that, and we need to ensure that as we're educating children going forward, that they recognize that they have a responsibility to know each other far better than their parents and grandparents did. So the next question we have is, how can non-Indigenous people participate as treaty people in reconciliation? Well, that's a good point. I've often heard it said by non-Indigenous people, by Europeans, by government leaders, in fact, in some cases, who say that, well, the treaties should just be ignored. The treaties don't mean anything, so let's just go on without them. And my response has been to that, well, if you don't believe in the treaties, then that means you don't believe in your land title. So that means you have to give back the land, because it's the treaties that have given rise to Crown land being perfected in many parts of Western Canada in particular, but other parts of the country as well. And the treaties, in fact, are really land surrender documents. And if the government or if the public want the treaties to be eliminated, then you have to recognize that that means that your right to claim ownership of the land and your right to govern the land also needs to be surrendered. You don't get one without the other. And that's a difficult idea for people to get their heads around, because they think automatically that treaties are just for the benefit of Indigenous people, but they're not. Treaties are for the benefit of non-Indigenous people as well. And you often hear, in fact, the message that is publicly shared that we are all treaty people, and that's true. You have an obligation to respect the treaty for your own purposes, as do Indigenous people, to hold government to account to fulfill the treaties, because the government, almost from the beginning, refused to fulfill the treaties to their entirety. There are many provisions in the treaties that have been ignored from the time that the treaties were signed, because as was said in a public document that came from the United States but formed part of Canadian policy as well, the purpose of signing a treaty with Indigenous people was simply to get them off the land. And once we got them to sign the treaty, then that was the end of our obligation. Now we could go onto their land, and they have no basis to resist us. So you need to recognize the importance of upholding the treaty, but not only that, upholding what the treaty stands for. And what the treaty stands for is that we will be in a relationship forever into the future, that we will be partners in this confederation, that we will be sharing this territory as was intended by those who negotiated the treaties. When you look at the treaty negotiations, and in fact that's one of the things educators can do, is to teach about the treaty negotiation process and what was said by the non-Indigenous people and what was said by the Indigenous people at the time the treaties were negotiated. You can see that the Indigenous people were saying that we will sign this document so that we can share this land with you. So it was always about sharing. And the government did not know that the purpose was to get them off the land and isolated in small Indian reservations. We also have another question about whether you think reconciliation is moving forward further in different regions of the country. Well, I think I've already said that probably the area of greatest growth and reconciliation so far has been in the area of education. I've seen curriculum changes all across Canada. The Northwest Territories, the Yukon, and Nunavut have led the country in terms of changing their curriculum materials to ensure that the children who are going to schools in those territories are taught a balanced history of this country. And that's also true in individual schools in parts of Canada. But getting the school departments, the departments of education, and the school curriculum committees within the departments of education to look seriously and to take seriously the responsibility of changing the curriculum materials, of adding curriculum materials that tell a more balanced history about the impact of residential schools and about the history of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people has been more difficult, because there are still many who push back against the idea that Indigenous people have any right to claim that they have, they have a special story to tell about the impact of this history upon them. So they don't want to tell that story. Just recently in Alberta, their curriculum committee said that residential schools should not be mentioned until children are in high school, because it might be too traumatic for young children. Without regard to the fact that we teach about the world wars, and we teach about the impact of the world wars to children as young as grade 1, because we want them to understand what Remembrance Day is all about. We want them to understand why there are veterans who are in their families, and what the role of the veteran is, and what their responsibility to respect the veteran is all about. And we want to teach them that. And so we don't feel that that's going to be traumatic for them. Why do we feel that it's going to be traumatic for them to learn that the government of Canada violently oppressed Indigenous people for many generations in this country because it was convenient to the expansion of the Dominion into the West? And I think that teaching that in an appropriate way for the age of the child and the grade of the child can be done. It can be accomplished. It's being accomplished. Many teachers are doing it, and I've seen the results of it. I get invited to speak to school classes all across the country to talk about what the survivors' stories are like, and what they learned, and what they need to learn. And I can tell you that it's not traumatic at all. It's a really important educational moment. And so moving forward, I can see differences. Ontario stopped their curriculum committee from doing any significant changes, and I don't think it's any surprise that those governments are led by ultra-conservative thinkers, and it's that part of that element of our society that will continue to resist the reconfiguration of our thinking around history, because they simply don't accept it, and don't believe it, and will resist it. So I have a question here from Al. Can the Western sciences help with reconciliation? For example, archaeology, biology. Can Western science complement oral history? Well, indeed it can. I have a very good friend who is an archaeologist who works with Indigenous archaeologists in the United States, and they set out to show, in fact, that many of the traditional stories and teachings that Indigenous people were telling, the various tribes were telling, in scientific evidence, and they proved many of the stories were quite accurate. And it's that element of the sciences that has literally kind of switched the conversation, because archaeologists, for the most part, have declined to explore large parts of North America. In the words of Louis Leakey's son, the North American continent is the least archaeologically explored part of the world. And it's because, he said, we don't want to find out what we don't want to find out. And he said if we were to do more archaeological exploration, then we would have to explain away some of the archaeological myths that exist, such as the Bering Strait theory, for example. The Bering Strait theory has been a suspect theory virtually from its beginning, and has certainly been rejected by Indigenous people going back a long time. And the Bering Strait theory was said to be the basis upon which Indigenous people came to this part of the world, and that they only came to this part of the world about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Then they said, well, maybe 12,000 years ago. But now, through archaeological work that's been done, they found archaeological evidence which shows human habitation in parts of North America as far as 100,000 years ago. And that can't yet be explained, but it is evidence that needs an explanation. And more archaeological work is going to have to be done. Biology is another area where partnership work between Indigenous teachings, Indigenous knowledge, and the work of Western science and Western scientists can achieve a better understanding of why things are the way they are and what's going on in the world around us. A great deal of what passes for plant knowledge and human knowledge about life and how life evolves and how creatures evolve and how creatures behave and why they behave. There are teachings about that I've heard when I've gone to visit many tribal elders in parts of the world. I've been to Nevada, visited with the Navajo elders, and they talk about their traditional stories about how life changed over many thousands of years down there, and that they predict based upon that it's going to change in a particular way. And the biological evidence to this point has shown that in fact there seems to be a trend in the plant life changes that are going on down there that is in keeping with that. Climate change is an area where the traditional elders have had a lot to say about climate change. If you talk to the Inuit people in the north, they have teachings and songs and ceremonies around climate change that they will tell you allow them to learn how to live off the land better and teach them how to react to the changes in the way the land is changing. And it's really quite interesting because you may remember the so-called discovery of the Franklin expedition was hailed as a huge scientific breakthrough, and yet when the scientists, after they found the archaeological evidence of the Franklin expedition, were confronted by Inuit elders who said, well, all you had to do was ask us. We could have told you where those boats were. We could have told you what happened to those people because it's part of our story. Because we were there. Our people were there. And they continue to tell those stories about what happened and what was going on and what they did to help and how they use that. So yeah, there's a lot more that needs to be done to marry them together, but at the same time, it's coming along. All right, so I have another question. What can newcomers do to learn more about Indigenous culture? Thank you. That's a very good question because it's part of a chapter that we wrote in the TRC report, and I think it's worthwhile to take a look at that. One of the things that we pointed out is that newcomers to this country these days, in the last few decades, have generally been coming from South Asia and Asian communities, and that one needs to examine what they are being taught in those school systems about North American culture, North American history, in order to determine what it is that they know when they get here and what it is that they think when they get here. I was mentioning in another presentation that it really is quite alarming to encounter newcomers who come here who say that they were surprised to see Indigenous people who are not living in teepees, who are not running around naked in the trees, that they thought that that's the way it was, and that there are some who come here who are even surprised that there are still Indigenous people. They thought they all died out. And so it's about ensuring that when newcomers come here, that attention is paid to the fact that they may need to receive a more fulsome educational program that ensures that they, when they enter the country and when they begin to participate in society, that they are educated to the point where they have a more balanced view of what this country is all about and what the history of this country has been about. The other thing, incidentally, before I forget, the other thing I just wanted to mention in regard to that is that the elders, particularly in the West Coast, the elders are really keen because there is such a large exposure to Chinese people who came over to work on the railway and settled in the West Coast areas, particularly up and down the coast. There's a very significant degree of openness among the West Coast tribes to embrace the opportunity to engage with people from that part of the world. And so newcomers in particular would have an opportunity to learn from those tribal elders and tribal institutes about what their cultures are like. So that's a good it's a good starting point. Those who come from other parts of the world, who come from Europe, for example, they're going to be blessed with having very little experience with Indigenous people other than movies and books and things. And they will need to be given more educational opportunities than we are currently providing to them. All right, so I have another one. In your opinion, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a success? Well, if I say no to that, then I'm admitting I was a failure, right? And I don't want to do that. But let me tell you why I think that we need to think of it not simply as on the basis of what's been going on since the commission reported. When we started off, the level of awareness, level of awareness of residential schools in particular, but the state of affairs of Indigenous people was very low in Canada. We did a survey, and the survey results are in the TRC report. We did a survey of Canadians in which we asked them, what do you know, essentially, what do you know about it, residential schools? And the general response was very little. Somewhere less than 20% of people actually knew that there had been residential schools, and none of them name or school in their rural area. And so the level of awareness was very low. None of them could point to the fact that they knew anybody who had gone to a residential school. So we had almost a 0% report rate on that. By the time the TRC finished, those numbers had gone up incredibly high. We had an awareness level that was in excess of 50% of those who were surveyed, that they were now aware of residential schools, that they were aware of where a residential school was in their area, because their interest had been piqued by the work of the schools. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because of the way that we set out to do the work of the TRC. We deliberately set out to do our work in a public way, to engage with Canadian society as we were doing our hearings, to allow the survivors, when they told us their stories, to also tell their story at the same time to the Canadian public through webcasting services. We started off our first national event in Winnipeg in 2010. We had about 20,000 people who were watching that event through webcasting services and who were on the ground with us on site. But by the time we did our final report in December of 2015, we had about 5,000 people in the room when we delivered our report who were listening. But we also had another 60-some thousand hits, in other words, sites on the internet who were also watching. And most of those sites were public sites like universities where they set up a broadcasting facility in the gymnasium or in a community or in a school, large classroom or large theater, so that students could come and watch, and even members of the public could go and watch. And so of those several thousand sites that had set up that way, our based upon the knowledge that our tech people had, they estimated that somewhere over 300,000 people were watching the closing event around the world. And so I think the success of the TRC is because of the way we educated the Canadian public and the world about what really went on in this country. All right, another question. What infrastructures need to replace the youth justice system? I don't think there's ever going to be a time when we will not need some kind of incarceratory system, because there are some youth who are essentially adults who are they're following along criminal behavior lines, and I think we need to be able to distinguish between those who are committed to that lifestyle and those who are not. And so for the protection of society, we need to recognize that there is that element. The problem that we have with the youth justice system is that we default to incarceration too quickly and too easily, when in reality, the vast majority of young people caught up in the justice system are children who are young people who are there because of social conditions and social problems that they're facing, where they are unable to find other options than to choose to engage in the kind of activities that get them into trouble with the law. And then they get caught. And sometimes they themselves are victimized because they're the ones that get thrown out first by the real criminals, the ones who are running the show, the gang leaders, for example, will use the young kids to run their drugs or to carry their drugs or to deliver their drugs or to be the ones to carry the guns and carry the weapons, or to get involved in the street fights. And so they'll challenge them to go out and find somebody to beat up, or to go out and steal cars. And yet the gang leaders are giving that direction, but they're not who are just a young person following the order that he was directed to do, and was afraid not to because something would happen to him or might happen to a family member. So the youth justice system needs to be, for those people, more oriented towards child protection, needs to be more oriented to protecting children from being taken advantage of by those who are truly living a criminal lifestyle. And we need to be more heavy-handed when it comes to that. And we also need to have a better child welfare system, or a better youth welfare system that protects children as well from being placed into an institution or into a setting where they are forgotten and where they are still not allowed to or able to answer those 4 questions that I talked about earlier. And we've seen evidence of that in the use of private institutions in Ontario, where literally people are taking kids into care because there's a lot of money in it. But once they get them into care, they don't do anything with them except put them in a room. Manitoba, for example, for the longest time used to put older teenagers into hotels and just leave them there. Well, thanks everybody for all your questions. I have a note on my screen, and I don't know if I was to read it or if everybody can read it. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I think we're reaching the end of our time. So I'm glad that I was able to be part of this event, and I hope that someday I'll be able to meet some of you face to face and we can talk about the time that we shared together.
Hi, I'm Leanne Tuntland-Wiebe, and I'm the Deputy Mayor of the City of Swift Current, as well as a member of our local Truth and Reconciliation Committee. On behalf of the City of Swift Current, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has attended and participated in our Truth and Reconciliation event today, and in particular, today's guest speaker, Senator Murray Sinclair. I'd also like to thank our Truth and Reconciliation Committee for hosting this series of events, which raise awareness and allow us to collectively take steps towards reconciliation. In addition, I'd like to thank Derek and Caitlin Newstater from the Landing Studio for making the presentations as seamless as possible, and Councillor Ryan Schweitzer for his work behind the scenes on this event. In closing, I'd like to thank our event partners, SAS Culture, the Chinook School Division, Innovation Credit Union, the Southwest Multicultural Association, the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan, Great Plains College, the Newcomer Welcome Centre, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, the Chinook Regional Library, the City of Swift Current, and many other individuals from the community. Thank you for your support.